Hi everyone, today we're going to discuss the first paper that you'll write. And as you look at the document, you'll see it's not a traditional paper. It's more of a series of short answers. And that's because we're going to ease our way into more serious writing and start with something a bit easier. Still, we're trying to address some of the things that we would need to do to write a new chapter for a high school history textbook. Right away, we need to figure out what we would want to add to our new chapter that's not already in the textbook reading we completed. These new terms have to come from the two articles we read, which were Elliott West, Reconstructing Race, and Erica Lee, The Chinese Example. Don't go out and do research somewhere else because terms not included in these two articles will not count. Your task here is to figure out 10 new terms that aren't currently in the textbook reading that you think would be essential to add to a new chapter. And I use term broadly to include things like people, court cases, legislation, military battles, or concepts. Essentially, the types of things that would show up in bold in a textbook. And so as you craft your list and you're wondering if something would count, just feel free to email me. Once you've chosen your 10 new terms, you need to do two things with each term. First, you need to define it. Essentially, what basic information would you want a high school student to know about the term? And I offered an example here of how I would define the Freedmen's Bureau if it wasn't already in the textbook. And so here I write, it was established by Congress to provide food, clothing, hospitals, legal protection, and education for former slaves and poor whites in the South in 1865. If your term is a person, sometimes students struggle with how to define a person. So let's say we were writing a new chapter on the 1930s and we wanted to add Franklin Roosevelt. Something simple like Franklin Roosevelt was president of the United States from 1933 to 1945 would suffice. The second piece is more difficult. Here you need to explain why this new term, is essential to include in a new chapter. And here I'm looking for something more than it was important for African Americans if we're dealing with the Freedmen's Bureau. That's a response I would expect from someone in middle school. I want you to turn your brain on and do some thinking. What are students supposed to learn from the term that justifies its incorporation into the chapter? That's a question you should ask. And so here I write, it's essential to include in the chapter because it shows the lengths the federal government went to intervene on behalf of African Americans, but it also shows the limits of that intervention because it ultimately failed to protect fully African Americans' rights. And so there's some words here that you can copy when you write about your own terms because it helps force you to answer the question properly. So feel free to copy and put in for each of your terms when you get to the importance of the term part. It's essential to include because it shows, right? That phrase kind of forces you in the right direction to talk about the term's importance. All right, so the next thing you need to do is to write a new opening paragraph for this new chapter. One thing that's missing in high school history textbooks are good introductions that help students understand the significance of the chapter and what ties everything together. And if you look at the introduction to the chapter on Reconstruction that we read, it simply, dives right into an important term rather than setting up the chapter for students. And it helps basically create that really super boring model of this happened and then this happened and this happened and we're done. And we don't want to do that. So right away, we want to explain to these students why it's important to discuss minority groups together in a single chapter. Right? We need to think about what students will learn about race and ethnicity in the mid to late 19th century that would be different if they read just basically the scattered accounts divvied up in separate chapters that we looked at in the textbook reading that we did. Right? What new ideas and conclusions can you offer that wouldn't be there if everything was scattered in different chapters? And so Elliott West's article, Reconstructing Race, would be helpful in writing that opening paragraph. That entire article tries to answer some of the questions I just posed. Also, when I ask for a paragraph, I always get questions about how long I want the paragraph to be. So I give you a rough length for reference here. A good paragraph would be about 250 words. And so finally, I want you to write a closing paragraph for this new textbook chapter. Conclusions, just like introductions, are there to help students make sense of everything in the chapter. And so one way to do that is to explain why the chapter ends when it does. And so this new chapter that we're envisioning will end in the 1880s and 1890s. So go back to the readings and think about what happened in those decades that are so big and transformative that they justify ending the chapter there. And so here, Erica Lee's article will help, and also the final pages of the textbook reading concerning African Americans will also help. And so there's some basic formatting rules here. As we move to the next papers, I'll start asking for more specific forms of formatting, but this is a basic short answer paper. Also, feel free to download this Word document and put your answers below each task, or you can create your own Word document. Just make sure it's clear which task you're completing. You will turn in the paper on Blackboard. I'm going to go back to the Learning Module section. And so in the Learning Module section, there's a special folder for the paper marked Paper 1 Turn-In. Make sure, once you're there, that you attach the file and you don't hit the Write Submission and just copy and paste the paper. Don't do that. Make sure that you attach the file. Remember that I'm here as a resource, so please email me if you're struggling to understand something. We can exchange emails, talk over the phone, or Skype.